Okay, I think so. I think we're live. So I just want to welcome everyone to tonight's meeting on women's health and an All Ireland National Health Service. I'm Maeve O'Neill. I'm a physiotherapist working on the front line currently in Altnagalvin Hospital in Derry. And as part of the campaign for an All Ireland National Health Service, we've been holding a series of meetings on the need for a national health service across the 32 counties and how this transformed health service would address many of the health and wellbeing challenges and inequalities that we face today. So tonight we have an excellent panel of speakers. Each who are going to speak for about 7 to 8 minutes. So there's a comment section at the bottom. So please feel free during the talk tonight to add any questions or contributions in the comment section. For anyone who's interested in getting involved in the campaign, there's a link to sign up to the campaign also in the comments section. And we've done 2 previous discussions on the launch of the campaign and also on the coronavirus and its impacts on the campaign. So they can be found on our Facebook page, which is a campaign for an All Ireland National Health Service. So back to tonight's meeting. So we have 4 excellent speakers, as I said, tonight. And first up, we have Alva Smith, who is a co-director of the Together for Yes campaign. And she was a convener of the coalition to repeal the 8th Amendment. And she is also an LGBT feminist activist and former academic at UCD. So Alva, if you want to just begin.
Okay, hi everybody, and thank you very much, Maeve, and also very glad to see the campaign up and running and to be part of it. There are just 3 areas that I want to touch on very briefly really this evening, and they're the global impact of the pandemic on women's health. I want to say a few words about COVID-19 and Ireland, and then probably not as long as I'd like, but a few words on the programme for government. I mean, first of all, the first thing to start off with, and I think it is really important to put this into a global context, that everywhere women's health is a huge problem. And it's been described by Natalie Kanan of the United Nations FPA as at the present time, the women's health is a catastrophe, she said, within a catastrophe. So you have the catastrophe of the pandemic and you have the catastrophic impacts of that pandemic on women in particular, with, for example, they reckon something in the region of 7 million unplanned pregnancies, 31 million cases of violence against women. Every day, reproductive and maternal health care just simply, a lot of it is cancelled, or else it's being carried out in very, very difficult circumstances. All of this within the context of deepening inequalities. And furthermore, women's reproductive rights in particular increasingly under threat. And you add to that and you think about it and you think, what's happening to women? And then you realize that 70% of the global health workforce are women. And the majority of that 70% are in much the lower paid sector. So I think there is a global situation that we locate ourselves within in Ireland. Just to turn then to Ireland to say, well, we learned a great deal about the health service during over the past 3 months, and in fact we're still learning the speed of change, all the kinds of things that the takeover of the private hospitals, how quickly that was able to happen, the way in which the medical profession was able to move on with amazing and remarkable alacrity and no stuff about contracts or anything of that kind, and are now doing teleprescribing and teleconsultations and so on and so forth, all demonstrating that if the will is there to take swift, prompt action for all, that the service and the professionals and the healthcare workers are absolutely capable of doing it. However, I think that what this pandemic is layered on top of existing inequalities, and it has served to lay bare all of those inequalities as well as actually making them worse. And what it did, I think, in Ireland was to make absolutely crystal clear, we knew it, but to people who either pretended not to know it or chose not to see it, it revealed the gaping holes in the Irish social and healthcare systems, where there are simply no safety nets for so many people, or safety nets that are really very, very poor indeed. And we know that marginalisation, disadvantage, discrimination, poverty, low pay, homelessness, your ethnicity, whether you have a disability, your particular age, very young or rather old, your sexuality, and so on and so forth, that all of these factors, particularly intersecting with gender, are really the biggest contributors to very, very poor health outcomes for people. So I think that, we've become very, very aware of that in relation to some groups during this pandemic, not always in relation to women, or not always specifically in relation to women, although it is very much there. We should have learned, I think, very powerful lessons about the needs of these particular groups and their increased vulnerability to viral infection. But it seems to me that that really hasn't happened. And that there has been very, very little understanding of one of the key things to emerge, which is that really we need much closer links between health and social care. One of the reasons for the absolute devastation of people's lives, one way and another, their lives and their health in the nursing and in the care homes, was of that failure to see that relationship between social and health care. So we do have a really very serious situation here because it's very clear from the programme for government, and this is my final point, it's very clear from the programme that really the three parties, when they came together, you could almost say, reading the programme for government and certainly reading the health section, and specifically the section on women, it was almost as if there had been no pandemic at all, because it certainly doesn't appear. For example, the health section is in relation to women is called promoting women's health, but it's nowhere indicated in the blunt page that we have before us, which women are they actually talking about? And is there an awareness that the playing field is not actually the same for all women? So there is still this lumping together of people without having any respect whatsoever for the difference to health and well-being and ultimate health outcomes that the disadvantages I mentioned can have. The second point I want to make about it is that really that section, promoting women's health, contains very little that's new. In fact, I was thinking to myself when I read it first, I thought, oh, it's a move on here situation. There's nothing new to see. It's very hasty. It's very cursory. There isn't any real vision in it that I can detect at all. And an awful lot, most, in fact, of what it's recommending or what it's stating it will do is already, they were commitments that have already been made or is already in process. We have to hope that the Women's Health Task Force will actually lead to an action group, and Orla O'Connor may very well say something about that later, I don't know. But by and large, all of this was in there before. Cervical check, free contraception. We were promised that actually during the course of the repeal campaign. It still hasn't come through. Breast check up to 69, that's great, but 69 is still nowadays, I can attest to that, really very young. So we're not getting very far. Exclusion zones are to be put in place around abortion clinics, except that they're not called abortion clinics or abortion services. I think they're called something like medical services, something like that. And none of these things, in any case, have timeframes on them, and all of them are uncosted, or if they have been costed elsewhere, they don't appear in the programme for government, and it doesn't cost anything, the programme for government. So there is also nothing about mental health in relation to women specifically. You have to go to a different section. There is absolutely nothing about violence against women, and domestic violence is a huge contributory factor to women's physical ill health, psychological, emotional, and mental ill health. And it just simply is not mentioned at all. And in relation to abortion, it simply notes that the review will be carried out of the legislation within the next, actually it'll be another year and a half. Nothing about teleconsultations, for example, to get rid of the mortifying 3-day waiting period, or at least to make that 3-day period more accessible for women, ensuring that they don't have to arrange childcare, get time off work, get a bus, and so on and so forth. So it's very disappointing, not just disappointing, it's actually quite shameful. If this is the best those three parties could come up with in relation to women's health, it is nothing short of a holy show. I think I'm most upset in a way that it doesn't make any attempt at all to differentiate between groups of women. Some needs in common, but some definite considerable investment necessary in a number of different areas. It also fails to address, as far as I can see, the need for proper pay, increased conditions, and absolute recognition of the value of all healthcare workers. And our proportion of healthcare workers here in Ireland is similar to the 70% proportion for the world generally. So what I would say in relation to that is that the French healthcare workers have got this absolutely right. They went and they marched through the cities of France. They marched through Paris, they marched through Lyon, and I don't know where not, to protest and to demand that the recognition and the acclaim that they had got during the worst of the pandemic, that should carry through, and that there should be specific changes made to their conditions of work and to their pay. And, you know, heaven knows, we all know how much we owe to the people who risked so much for us and so many other essential workers. And I think it is so important for us all over this island to be saying that needs to be recognised in concrete material terms. My last point is to say that there is a comment in the programme for government that they will accelerate sláinte care. The defects of sláinte care are not very specifically addressed. It doesn't say how it is to be accelerated. It doesn't say how the difficulties with consultants and others are to be overcome. And it has become very, very watered down. So I think we have a great deal of work to do here. And I know that that is echoed in relation to the NHS in the north. So thank you very much for listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Alva. We've got a few questions there, but we'll leave the questions to when after all the speakers have spoken. So next up we have Adrienne Wallace. Adrienne is a PVP councillor in Carlow County Council, and she's been a leading activist in the Carlow Women's Refuge campaign. So, Adrienne.
Thanks very much, Maeve. So yeah, I just want to talk for maybe 6 or 7 or 8 minutes, maybe just a little bit on kind of the health inequalities that women have suffered, and I suppose the argument and the case for an all-Ireland NHS system. So just one thing there as well is that we've been here in Carlow campaigning very hard for a women's refuge. We're one of 9 counties that don't have one, and I called together a meeting with Tulsa on this. Now, the minute I went into the meeting, it was supposed to be just a one-on-one over different reports and so on and so forth. And walk into the meeting, there's 3 people very much suited and booted there, which I really think was an attempt to kind of intimidate. And consistently, while arguing for, and we've seen the rise in domestic violence, while arguing for this, I kept being told, money for value, cost of this and cost of that. And it really, really came clear that Tulsa, as a state body, were very much concerned with kind of keeping the numbers down and not necessarily women's well-being, and definitely not children's well-being. So it was just an insight for me that I noticed when you're dealing with these state bodies, that they very do much kind of carry on the function of the government, which is look after the pennies, and they send the pounds up to the kind of top tier in society as a result. Just in Carlow as well, we still we're one of the few counties in Ireland that still has no access to abortion services here. The closest doctor that would offer it is in Graiguenamanagh, which is about a 2-hour bus journey away. So there's huge issues here with access still, despite the fact that we repealed the 8th. And one of those issues is that there's actually the scanning equipment has been privatized across the southeast. So you would hire out this scanning materials, or the scanning equipment that you would use to estimate digestion and all that, and that has been privatized, and doctors locally then can't actually get their hands on it to provide the service. So we've seen that privatization is actually being a roadblock into abortion service here in Carlow. Just as well, very briefly, I just want to mention kind of about women healthcare workers. The majority of the healthcare workers, and particularly kind of in care services and care in Ireland, is traditionally female. And as it's often actually one of the most undervalued and underpaid jobs that is out there. And if you look at the programme for government, they kind of applaud the hard work and the risk that nurses in particular took on themselves during this crisis. And Ireland actually had one of the highest rates of healthcare worker infections in Europe. Now, how did the government reward that? Not by a pay rise, not by any reward pay or anything like that, but it actually goes back to very much the same, an actual back to a sort of failed healthcare system where there was huge issues. Before this pandemic hit, we already had a healthcare crisis in Ireland, and that is a very well-known fact. So the government are always kind of applauding, the high risk people, the bankers, the entrepreneurs, the people who go out and put their necks on a risk, and they're very willing to bail them out anytime there's a bit of difficulty. When it comes to actually the people who very much put themselves and their health and their families at risk, the government kind of say, actually, we're going back to a failed healthcare system, and that's how they reward people. So I think we really need to make sure that there's no back to that type of normal, and that we demand a lot more for what we have done throughout this crisis, because it is workers that made sure we were safe. It is workers made sure that we had food in our presses and in our shops, and we need to make sure that there's a living wage there, that there is good support and there's security for an awful lot of these workers. So just one thing I want to kind of say on the health inequality within Ireland, like we do have a sort of historic failure of it, particularly relating to women. If you look at Savita Halapanarva, the cervical check scandal, which was a direct result of outsourcing. They wanted to save money, they wanted to cut costs, and as a result of that, women have lost their lives, and we have an ongoing scandal and an ongoing issue. So again, it's just that theme within government and state bodies of saving the money, and as a result, particularly women kind of get the sharp edge of this. We also have the symptomotomies of the 80s, and that is still an ongoing issue here in Ireland. But you have the I might be pronouncing some of these wrong now as well, but thalidomide from the 60s was essentially a sort of drug that was given and it was supposed to help with morning sickness, and it actually went on to be shown to have a huge amount of birth defects for women's pregnancies. And at the time, the government, and this again is still an ongoing issue, and a lot of people haven't had any of the redress from these scandals and these attacks, but the government at the time decided, actively and consciously decided, not to have a public announcement and a public recall of the drug when its links to malformation became apparent, and instead they sent a confidential note to some of the doctors. As a result of that, it's been proven, I think, that about 12 women have been affected when they could not have been. So the government again there chose not to do anything. So there is a historic neglect on women's health issue, but even today this continues. And if you look at one issue in particular is endometriosis. So this is where the tissue that would usually grow inside your uterus actually grows on the outside, and it can have chronic pain as a result of it. 1 in 10 in women actually suffer from this in Ireland, so over 150,000. But so little of it is actually understood, despite that it is one of the most commonly seen gynecological issues or diseases here in Ireland. Women face a 9-year diagnostic delay, and the chairperson of the Endometriosis Association of Ireland actually said that women go in kind of armed with information, that they have their leaflets, they've done their research on this issue, and that they're told they want a referral and they're asking to get the treatment they want and need, and they're actually instead often referred to mental health services. So you can kind of see that historic neglect is still very much prevalent here in Ireland, and it's something that we need to fight against. But it's not just in with sort of reproductive issues as well that that these issues arise, but we've even seen that women are less likely to be treated for pain, and particularly if you are a black woman, you're less likely to be listened to overall, is kind of really at the core of this. That women are more likely to be misdiagnosed after a heart attack and are less likely to receive the right treatment. A US study, so we do kind of see that it is a global issue, but it becomes very sort of isolated in certain instances here than in Ireland. But a US study found that women and men are more likely to survive a heart attack if the doctor is female. So I think some of that sort of deep systemic sexism is apparent within our healthcare system globally, and definitely here in Ireland as well. It's also seen that women have kind of are also faced across the board, from Crohn's disease to elder disease, that women actually are longer getting a diagnosis compared to men. So there are a lot of issues around this that are ongoing. Now, why we think you need an NHS type system this corner in this country, and I think a lot of people would agree to us, is showing us that um, how we responded to this pandemic, and the program for government says that they did so, that the healthcare system did so in a good um, it responded well, is what is the words he used, only insofar as that it had to radically change everything it was. Instead of becoming a two-tier system that didn't recruit, it became a one-tier health system that had a massive call for more workers to come and join the workforce and help deal with this issue. So that kind of goes to show the government have acknowledged themselves that their policy on healthcare had failed. Um, and I remember Simon Harris saying at the start of all this, we can't treat a COVID-19 patient differently. We can't have one on private and one on public. Well, then why would you do that for health, for your heart, or for cancer? Why would you differentiate on anyone's health according to how much money that they have in their pocket? So they've really acknowledged themselves that this system isn't fit for purpose. And now I think it's very important that we ourselves actually learn to challenge that, and we have to challenge that and take it, as I said, out onto the streets, as the nurses did when they were out fighting for their pay increases. We think that it's important we nationalise the health service as it stands here. We saw that the government actually paid 4 times more than the Tories did in the UK to take over these private hospitals. That shouldn't be dead money. That shouldn't be money that just goes up to the Larry Goodmans and the Dennis O'Briens and the other owners of these private hospitals. That money now actually needs to produce something for us as a society and as a people who've gone through a very tough time and a pandemic. That money needs to come back to us in the form of a one-tier health system. And I think it's important that we do actually make a move to nationalise those private hospitals. But what it has shown us is that all these things are possible. What has been missing was the will, let's say, the political will, because when the move was needed, they were able to kind of make this happen. But I think across the board as well, you need more minor injury units. I for one had to just had a minor injury in my hand, but I had to go to an A&E where I was holding up people that were having like epileptic seizures, heart issues, and chest issues. So we need a hell of a lot no more of primary care and public funded primary care centres across the country here. We also actually, Ireland pays one of the highest when it comes to the drugs and the pharmacy that we use. And as a result of that sort of deep connection, I think, with the pharma industry in Ireland, I think that's a direct result. So we want to bring down the cost of drug use in Ireland and definitely have a lot more generic drugs instead of paying over the price sort of topics or prices for this. And just my last point here that I'll finish up on now as well is that all this can be done, and we've shown that, and the government have shown that, but what they haven't done is actually consistently pushed with it and gone for it. So what we want to see and the programme from a government absolutely is very weak on the health stuff. It comes out and it says we've come out with the biggest health crisis we faced. It has no spending projections, it has no cost proposals, no bed capacity targets. It doesn't once mention abortion. It doesn't once actually address the root issue of this. And you can see that access to healthcare is a cost issue and that there's huge roadblocks here. I know I myself had to go and access contraception and it ended up costing €300, which I had to put on a credit card. So imagine that in the 21st century, trying to access something as common day and something that should be as easily acceptable as contraception and having to pay interest on it to put it on a credit card. That's the situation a lot of working class women are in at this moment in time. And there's studies and a lot of research has been done that shows that people with medical cards actually go to the doctor more often, that they visit healthcare, that they get the healthcare that they need. So what that says is those without the financial means to access it don't, and that they could have a huge amount of underlying issues that they're just not getting seen to because they cannot afford to. So the core root issue here of all this is cost, and it is a big barrier for women. But it is a big barrier, I think, for many across the country. The programme from government just reverts back to sláinte care, which has been going on since 2015. It's going at a snail's pace, and policymakers have said that at every turn the government have actually blocked it. But what they do is they use sláinte care anytime they're in a debate, or anytime they need to defend their healthcare system, their two-tier healthcare system. They say, "Oh, sláinte care," and it becomes a bit of a name drop, which doesn't actually have any substance. And the programme for government essentially reiterates that, I think, very clearly. So we think we know you need an NHS type system. The coronavirus has shown us that it has to be 32 county, that if another pandemic or another virus hits at any stage, that we need to have a uniformed approach across the country. We need to see a full kind of reversal of these neoliberal privatization policies. As it stands, I think last year alone, the government gave about 445 million in tax relief to the private healthcare hospitals. And that really needs to be reversed, and that money needs to be spent into making publicly funded, nationalised 32 county NHS system where people are treated according to need and not wealth. But I think we do that by public pressure. I think we have a government going in that are very weak. They voted. The vote generally was a vote for change. The government have stitched it up, and we get more right wing policies. So I think it's a very weak government, and I think that we can really hammer them on this. And I think coming out of this pandemic, we want to get workers, healthcare workers with us. We want to get people who've been affected in a multiple of ways by this crisis, but by a sort of neglectful healthcare system, and we want to fight for a change. So I will leave it on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adrian. And definitely, we're not seeing any vision at all from the government, north or south. Like they're just trying to revert to the pre-crisis policy and push through sláinte care to try and embed this two-tier healthcare system. And one of the key demands from the campaign for All Ireland NHS is the end of privatisation of our health and social care system. And I know personally among like workers in the hospital that I work with that there's real appetite for change. Like the healthcare system's just not working and everybody knows it. And so often to help the people that come in the door to us, we can't help them with with our different treatments. What we need to do is change the world in which they live in, and now really is the chance, but it's not going to come from either of our governments, north and south. So next up we have Orla O'Connor, and Orla is the director of the National Women's Council of Ireland, and also was a co-director of the Together for Yes campaign.
Thanks, Maeve. I'm sorry, I know I was having some problems there, so I'm glad to be back. I think just first of all to say thank you for inviting us to be part of this, and also, we very enthusiastically have joined the campaign for an All Ireland National Healthcare Service because we absolutely see the need for this, and the need for this particularly in relation to women's health. So the National Women's Council, we represent about 190 women's organisations, and we're an all-Ireland body. And I think it's very clear that both North and South, both parts of the island, fall very far short in terms of achieving women's rights and equality for women. And very central to that is women's health. And I mean, we can see North-South women experiencing homelessness, women seeking asylum, women with addiction, older women, women with living with disabilities, travel and roamer women, all face multiple discrimination because of their gender, and then that is disproportionately impacted in terms of their health outcomes. And I think it is really important to say in the context of this campaign that women also disproportionately depend on public services, and they depend on those to mitigate the impacts of economic exclusion and also to support their disproportionate care responsibilities. And we know very much, and I mean, it's been said already, that in the South, women's health is so significantly impacted by our inequitable two-tier health service. So we think that in terms of looking at this campaign, that it's really important to have a very specific focus on women's health, because women have very different health experiences and they very different health outcomes. And in our work, in terms of being a feminist organisation and approaching our health work in that feminist framework, we found that there's sort of three approaches that guide us best in that. And that's to always consider the impact of women's life experiences on their health, to recognise women as their own experts in their health, and also to take that intersectional approach in terms of what we want to see achieved. Women are diverse, and we need to look at women's mental, physical and reproductive health through the different intersections of both identity, social positions and social structures. And that's very much the sort of the approach, for example, that the WHO have adopted. We know very specifically that there are women have different health needs. They live longer and they have more chronic disease. They're affected in much greater numbers by depression and anxiety. And then, in addition, women are more likely to parent alone, to experience domestic and sexual violence, to be in low-paid and precarious work. And in most households, and all the data shows this, that women bear the responsibility of their family's healthcare needs. And yet, in spite of all of that, health services often follow a very male model approach. So I think that that's really critical in terms of looking at this all-island approach, is how we can specifically look at women's health needs. And just the second thing I wanted to say is about the need for an all-Ireland approach. And that's why I think this campaign is really timely. Up to now, we know that for people, for example, living in border counties, an all-Ireland approach has always been vital. And it's been mainly looked at in terms of sort of complex and critical care conditions. But it's not just about those complex conditions. It's also crucial for women and their families at the most basic level of health and social care services. So on the one hand, in the programme for government, which we've mentioned a few times tonight, there is a mention of a shared island approach. But it's very clear that in that and in practically every other aspect of the programme for government, it is not referring to a development of an all-island approach in terms of public services and public infrastructure. And that's what we see as one of the significant gaps in terms of the programme for government, because we came through an election where people voted for change, and a key part of that change was about public services and the need to prioritise public services, public facilities, public infrastructure. And it's very clear within the programme for government that there isn't that coherent approach, and it's certainly not there in terms of healthcare. Just one of the issues I thought was probably useful to highlight in terms of this discussion around the campaign for an all-Ireland approach is, if we look, for example, at the example of abortion services, and, following the referendum here, we saw that abortion services were rolled out in the South. The early medical abortion service enabled women from the North, or the plan was to use HSE services, but it was being done at a huge cost to women. And in addition, in terms of the waiting day period, it meant that it was unlikely for many women from the North to avail of that. And instead, they were much more likely to travel for NHS covered care. So I think it's one of those examples of how critical that all-island approach will be, and how critical it is even right now. And then I wanted to say something about the whole piece around a universal healthcare and a public healthcare service, because this is something that we have been campaigning for more than 40 years. And it's a particularly sharp issue, I think, in the South, because despite being primarily tax funded, our health system does not provide universal access. We have a highly complex entitlement system. It's based on means-tested access to primary care and a really large state-subsidised private health insurance market. The Republic, is the only European country not to offer universal access to free or heavily subsidised GP care. And access to social care is subject to local budget caps, meaning that access depends often on where you live. It is such an unequal system where people are treated differently depending on their insurance status, on their ability to pay. And we have seen, and we've heard this already tonight, patients in the public system are subject to long waiting lists, delays, and those with greater resources can get treated far quicker, and often on public hospital sites. So the need for creating a universal healthcare system is absolutely critical, and it's even more critical for women because of the things that I said earlier in terms of women are disproportionately relying on quality public services. And I wanted to mention a few things in terms of the lessons from the current crisis, because in our view in the Women's Council, the crisis really has exposed the deep structural inequalities that are there in relation to women. It hasn't created them, but it has exposed them, it's highlighted them, and in some cases, for example, in domestic violence, it has caused an increase. And it's also shown that where there is a political will to make changes can actually happen very quickly. And we've seen that in some areas. For example, early on in the crisis, there was a campaign to have remote access in relation to abortion services. And that happened quickly. So there are some things that we want to see continue that were put in place during the crisis. But also it highlights again, I think, one of the failings in the programme for government, because some of that really positive stuff that got put in place is not being held on to, or at least there's no mention of that. And I think as well, the crisis has also shown that women's health and the impacts on women are an afterthought. And we've seen that in terms of the issue of maternity, where it just wasn't thought about. And it wasn't until women who it affected, organisations like ours in the Women's Council campaigned against it, and then we got it put in place. But it was very clear that women's needs were an afterthought. And probably I think the most tragic, most horrible example of that is in terms of our nursing homes, both in terms of workers and older people who have both contracted the virus and the high rates of deaths that we've had in our nursing homes. So I think the other issue, which is really important in terms of the crisis, is that we've seen the absolute critical nature of those who are providing health services and care services, and right across the board, whether that's in terms of home care workers, hospital cleaners, hospital care assistants. And they are also predominantly women and have so little job security and are also really reliant on low pay. And again, I think they're one of the issues that, in terms of the programme for government and how we judge it, again, that doesn't come through. And yet all of those things will be critical in terms of how we develop a public service. So just to finish, in our view in the Women's Council, this campaign is really important. It's very timely. And I think as well, it offers a really good opportunity in terms of having that conversation about why a universal public healthcare service is necessary for all, but it's particularly a feminist issue necessary for women. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Orla. Thank you. Focused on some really, really good points there. So to finish our initial speakers, we're going to have Fiona Ferguson. So Fiona is a pro-choice activist from Belfast, and she is also a people before profit councillor in Belfast City Council.
And thanks to everyone else who's spoken so far. I think that there's been some good points made already about the state of the NHS in the north and the need for a 32 county approach to winning an NHS across the island. But I think I want to take some time, if that's okay, just to speak about the particulars of the NHS in the north and what that means for the fight for a 32 county NHS right across this island. I think it's worth saying that we should absolutely, as a first point, fight for a 32 county NHS. We should fight for a healthcare system that's accessible for all, and which is absolutely single tier. But I think that it's important as well to recognise some of the problems with the NHS currently in the north and indeed across the water in Britain. But I think in particular some of the things that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, the impact of austerity on the NHS, the impact of cutbacks, of stripping back of local healthcare services has had a really detrimental impact on communities, particularly on working class communities and particularly on women, working class women in those communities. And I think that it's important to see that from the outset when we're fighting for a healthcare service which seeks to overcome those kind of things. I think that this was shown most clearly in the approach to the COVID-19 crisis in the north, which I have no hesitancy in referring to as shambolic. I think it's fair to say that people had a much worse experience of lockdown, particularly in care homes, and indeed that there were more deaths than there needed to be because of the approach by the Stormont executive, and in particular the health minister, to the COVID-19 crisis, and because of those 10 years of austerity, which stripped back the ability of the NHS locally to provide things like PPE or to have the resources on hand to provide that PPE in time of a pandemic. I think it's fair to say that parts of the NHS in the north are utterly broken and that we need to fight for that kind of change locally in the north, as well as fighting not to have the kind of things that we see in the north that could be detrimental in the south. Things like privatization. So we pay out a huge amount of money to private firms rather than keeping that money within the NHS to provide services in the way that we should. And that's something, again, that has increased over the last 10 years via the Stormont executive. It's a reality that the NHS in the north is very bureaucratic. There's a lot of money that's spent on management rather than on frontline services. And particularly, I think it's important to say that a lot of the health service staff in the north were forced to stand on pickets in the freezing cold winter just gone for basic pay. And I think it's a disgrace. It's really, it really sums up quite well the kind of disdain that has been shown to health workers in the north. And just like the south, and just like in other places around the world, those workers are predominantly women. And a lot of those workers are women from the BAME community. A lot of those women are women from working class communities who are underpaid, overworked, as I said, shown complete disdain from politicians in the north. And I think that when we're fighting for a 32 county NHS, we need to be talking about one that doesn't treat workers with disdain, that provides proper wages, but also provides proper conditions within our hospitals, as well as providing first class healthcare that's accessible to all and that's free at the point of use. So I think that's an important place to start. But I want to just very quickly move into some of the particular problems that we see in the NHS in the north relating to women and what kind of things that we should be fighting for in a different kind of all-Ireland NHS. Because just to sum up the point about the NHS in the north, I don't think that we should be talking about extending a carbon copy of what we have in the north to the south. Just as pro-choice activists in the north said, we don't want to just fight for a carbon copy of the abortion laws that the south of Ireland got after repeal. We know that we can do better. We've seen from the experience of women in the south that we have to do better in terms of access to abortion, and we're continuing to fight for better for that across the island. We need to recognise what the problems are that allow women, the BAME community and working class communities to slip through the cracks and fight for an NHS across the island, which provides for all of those people. I actually learned today, this is interesting, but it's depressing as hell, so I'm not sure why I'm smiling. I'll brace you for that one. the NHS in the north is broken down into trusts on a regional basis, and the Southern Trust, so Southern in terms of the north, not Southern in terms of a lot of yourselves, in terms of the island, were recently trying to work out how they could provide abortion services, because obviously we've had decriminalisation recently, and I'll come on to that in a second. And it kind of came out in the outworkings of that there are no specific contraceptive services provided by the Southern Trust in the north. So what that means is that women can go to their doctors and get barrier method contraception, or they can get the pill, but access to things like the coil or an IUD, which might not be available by their GP, is simply not available at all, which strips back that choice from women, which removes the choice of contraception completely for women who have, for example, allergies to latex or hormonal issues, which means that they can't take the pill. I think it is fair to say that whether it's reproductive issues like that, or whether it's inequality issues, which particularly affect women, the kind of things that were talked about by Adrienne, by Orla, about how women's healthcare is relegated, and Alva talked about this on a global scale, is very much true as well in the north, but there is a particular stamp of political and social conservatism, which has had a really devastating effect on women's healthcare in the north of Ireland. And I think it's something that we need to give the boot, first of all, and that we never need to see come into the NHS across the 32 counties, because it has, as I say, had a devastating effect for women. You know, just some of the healthcare inequalities that we see, even where we have an NHS, when it's run the way that the NHS in the north is run, with an eye of austerity cast over it for a decade, we see healthcare inequalities widening. As Adrienne said, this is 2020. In a country with the kind of wealth that we have, north and south, comparatively with other countries around the world, there's absolutely no excuse for health inequalities to be widening, regardless of whether that's women's healthcare, disability healthcare, or anything else. But unfortunately, that has been the case. And one of the examples that I find was that over the last 2 years, women's life expectancy, the gap between working class deprived communities and more wealthy communities, has expanded. And interestingly, that's not just because women in more privileged communities are living longer. That's because there is a negative impact in more deprived communities, where working class women in deprived communities are living longer, they're dying sooner, and the gap currently is an average of around 5 years, which is really quite distressing to hear about a country that's meant to have access to the best healthcare system in the world. And I think that shows that we have quite a long way to go in the north, and quite a lot to fight back against. Those kind of gaps we're seeing widening in things like mental health, in terms of suicide rates, and as well in male life expectancy. And, you know, I think that these are the things that should be taken very seriously when we're talking about a new kind of NHS. The obvious point, of course, about where women's healthcare has been impacted detrimentally in the north and the south and around the world, in fact, is that issue of reproductive healthcare that I started to talk about with contraception. People will know that we recently won decriminalisation in the north, and I say won decriminalisation in the north because we fought damn hard for the decriminalisation of abortion in the north. We had to fight damn hard against politicians who sunk their nails in and really dug their heels in and refused to budge for far too many years, and saw women and others forced onto boats to England for abortion services, as you saw in the south. Even though we recently fought and won decriminalisation, and that was ratified, in fact, just last night in Westminster, which is incredible. Shouldn't have to happen in Westminster, of course, but our own local politicians seem steadfast in trying to oppose abortion access in the north. Even though that happened, we very recently, in the last couple of weeks, saw attacks on that by both the DUP and, interestingly, by Sinn Féin. So both of these parties, even though the legislation was ratified in Westminster and can't necessarily be upended so easily by Stormont, both those parties brought a motion and an amendment which were fundamentally anti-choice. and which sought to roll back on some of the provisions, which, by the way, were passed on the basis of the CEDAW consultation. If people don't know what that is, you can go look that up. It's CEDAW. The kind of things that it dealt with were looking at abortion as a right, as healthcare, and looking at best medical practice around the world and taking into account things like inequalities, whether that was class, whether that was race, or whatever else. Those outworkings of the CEDAW inquiry that were encapsulated in the decriminalisation of abortion in the North were just 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. Lockdowns sent our calendars all a bit stir crazy, I think. Were attacked by Sinn Féin and the DUP in an attempt to roll them back. So even when we're talking about a healthcare system which is meant to be free at the point of use, which is meant to be accessible to all, the political influence by conservative forces, or those who claim not to be conservative forces, whichever the case is, we need to be conscious of that, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to be ready to fight back against that. And fair play, I have to say, I want to take a second to say to the pro-choice activists in the North, whether that's Alliance for Choice, Amnesty International, or other groups, and the few political parties who stood up metaphorically and refused to take these attacks lightly, and pretty much storm social media with anger, with frustration, with just disbelief that the kind of things that we've been fighting for years were attempted to be rolled back in the one hand by some politicians who claim to support human rights and to support women's rights in particular. In terms of abortion access in the North, after decriminalisation, despite those recent parliamentary attacks, it's fair to say that there are other pretty huge issues. So it is possible for women to have access to the abortion pill at the moment through their GP, but not in all GPs. And I think that's the case, I'm right in saying, in the South as well. As well as that, there is absolutely no access to surgical abortion in the North, even though that is now legalized, even though it's decriminalized. The Minister for Health, I'm not afraid of saying it, the Department for Health, the Attorney General for a time, although he seems to be stepping down, all have played a very frustrating role in frustrating the process of getting abortion services in terms of surgical abortion off the ground. For one, if you want a perfect example of this, if you Google women's healthcare or abortion healthcare, Belfast, Derry, Northern Ireland, Ireland, whatever, the first hit you'll get is for Staunton Healthcare, which is a pro-choice fake front, which dupes women into pretending that they can help them get abortion services and delays them until they pass the point where they can legally access them. Really a disgusting organization that is funded by those who want to see abortion wiped off the map completely. The Minister for Health is aware of this. The Department for Health is aware of this. The trusts are aware of this because it's been raised by activists, by politicians, and nothing has been done. And worse, there are no plans to do anything, in the words of the Minister for Health. Moreover, when we ask the Minister for Health, whether that's through parliamentary questions, whether that's through activist questions, freedom of information requests, the answers that we get back about when surgical abortion will be available, why surgical abortion isn't currently available, even though it's not illegal, and what moves will be made to introduce surgical abortion, the answers are vague. They don't answer the question. And when they do, it is to say, that's a matter for the executive. Basically saying that unlike any other kind of healthcare, whether it's, a kidney transplant, a knee operation, any other healthcare service that is not criminalized, that is accessible on the NHS as abortion should be, this matter in particular is going to be dealt with by Sinn Féin, the DUP, the Alliance Party, the SDLP, and the Ulster Unionist Party. It baffles me. It baffles the majority of pro-choice activists in the North. And really, I think that it is a purposeful, despicable attempt by the Minister for Health or the Department for Health to avoid introducing surgical abortion in the North when women need access to it. The World Health Organization, the UN, the CEDAW Committee have referred to that frustration of the access to abortion in certain cases as tantamount to torture. And that is what continues in the north under the NHS. And that is the kind of thing that we will need to overcome when we're fighting for a healthcare system right across the north, which caters for everyone, which provides reproductive health care for women, particularly those women who suffer the inequalities that society pushes on them. And I'll just sum up by saying what I said at the start. We absolutely need an All-Ireland NHS. We absolutely need one that's single tier, that's free at the point of access, that's accessible everywhere, whether that's rural communities or cities. But crucially, and this is the lesson from the North, one that does not have privatisation near it, one that is fully invested in as a priority, that is safe from cutbacks, that is ring-fenced and that has money thrown at it because it is one of the most important things that we can have in a society, but also one that pays its workers decently and one which is accessible right across the North. And finally, whether it's women's healthcare in terms of contraception, whether it's women's healthcare in terms of abortion, the only way that we've managed to achieve those things is by a fight on the ground and by women rising up and fighting to win those things. And I think that that's the only way that we'll win an All-Ireland NHS that really works in our favour.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you so much to all our speakers this evening. I know we are a wee bit pushed for time, so I am going to just read out a few comments. I know that there's a few comments from, I think, a Kev person, but I think Fiona has probably addressed like a lot of those points raised with her talk there. So there's a few comments on maternity services. Nidavella has agreed with Adrian's assessment of the basis for the campaign for an NHS system. But in terms of the maternity services, Alexandra's asked, how could an All-Ireland NHS tackle discriminatory practices in places like maternity care, where unnecessary traumatic experiences are often downplayed? And Mary Smith speaks as a former midwife. She's very struck by the absence of a maternity service that properly meets the needs of women and babies. She says we need two things: more midwives who can lead the service in a community context, getting away from the consultant-led hospital-based service, and to stop funneling money through the public health service to private for-profit care. And I think there's an important question as well around sorry, I'm on the phone here. There's an important question around trans healthcare as well from Alexandra around what can an all-Ireland approach to healthcare do to tackle the woeful lack of healthcare for trans people, particularly considering how few endocrinologists we have in the south, and in the north it's not much better. I think they've not taken any new appointments in the clinic in the north. So if we want to maybe start with a few comments on those questions, but if we can keep them brief, that would be good. Alva, I think you wanted to touch on.
Well, I just was interested in the point that Alexandra made about the absence of the paucity of endocrinologists down here in the south. I don't know how many there are in the north, but I know that I think at the moment in the south there is not, as far as I'm aware, any plastic surgeon who works with trans people here. So that's a problem, but and I could be wrong about that, but in any case, it is almost none. And I think that it just occurs to me that it might be helpful at some time, at certain points in the campaign, to focus on particular areas where a common approach would be really valuable. And it would be about that where there is a very strong argument for the sharing of resources. And that's certainly an area which needs a lot more attention and a lot more service development, both north and south. So I would very strongly recommend that we keep it on our agendas. I also actually think that that probably does apply, or certainly should apply, to an all-Ireland planning and policy approach to both reproductive and maternal health care. And again, I think that's an area which would lend itself quite well, despite legislation in relation to abortion, which is different in two parts of the island. But I still think that there is something to be gained at times in this campaign from choosing to focus on specific areas where we would have some chance of getting agreement or support from medical professionals, as well as perhaps elements at least of the general public.
Thanks, Alva. And I think Adrian wants to come in on Mary's point.
Yeah, just very quickly, if you look at Mary Smith's point there as well, and herself being a former midwife, we don't just want to kind of transform the healthcare system. We also want to transform the workplace as it stands. And women particularly actually have the most to gain from this. Not only have we got a majority-led sort of workforce that is women, but we also take, and all the speakers touched on it today, we also take the brunt of the inequalities in the healthcare system. So we want one that is led from below, that it's the nurses, it's the midwives, it's the people that are actually on the ground seeing the issues who get to decide where the resources go, rather than this whole bureaucratic layer of middle management. And the root problem of all this, of the health inequality, really comes from capital investment and where that goes, and that the government have given 115 million a month, that they give 445 million last year in tax relief. And that money is public money, but it's been sent to the private sector. We want that money back into public health, into public hands, into the hands of workers. And I think it's important we don't forget the stories behind this. My friend's mother is suffering from dementia. Her husband, who's elderly as well, is now in care, or is her primary carer. He has not been able to get any assistance, handset. He was told to wash his elderly wife in a sink in the meantime. They're waiting years now to get something. And my friend even said, she goes, it's tough enough watching your mother go, but the fact that she has to do it so undignifiedly, and that is the state. I remember canvassing and coming across meeting this elderly woman who lived alone, who was going blind. She needed a very simple operation, but it was months and months and months. And as a result of this, she wasn't able to leave the house. She wasn't able to do her shopping. This is the real life effect that the state and the neoliberal policies are having on people. So we really, really need to oppose that, but we need to do that with nurses, with midwives, and with the community out on the streets, really, really fighting for change.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who wants to come in on those points?
Yeah, Maeve, I think just maybe on Mary's point first, because I think it's a really important one in terms of that whole community context and how you move away from that very medical model. That is such a huge issue for women. We did a lot of consultations in the South on the new maternity strategy, and it was one of the key things that kept coming up about how because there's a lot of lip service paid to that, but the resources aren't put in at a community level. So I think that's quite key in terms of the type of health service that we want. And also, and it links to, was it Alexandria? Her point in terms of trans people. It's also the point that in terms of the universal healthcare service, that needs to be able to look at different needs, and that we can really encapsulate a diversity of needs, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And I would really agree with Alva in terms of it would be very useful in this campaign if we could start talking about, so what does that look like? Because again, it's an area where lip service is paid to, but then we end up with this one generic model. So I think that could actually be quite helpful, and it could bring the campaign forward.
Thank you, Orla. So we have just a point there from Anita Villa around mental health services are the most underfunded in the north. Women are not only medicated in place of talking services, but also carry a high burden in supporting family members who are not receiving much needed care. So she is wondering how the panel would see this being addressed in relation to the campaign. But also, I want to bring in Marnie's point, which was excellent. She says that women are the vast majority of healthcare workers. Access to women's health has always been a political question, and women have led the agenda for change with repeal. So she's asking the panel, do you think that women can mobilise again around the fight for one public health service? So we've got the topic of mental health, and also taking inspiration from repeal to lead on this fight to transform our health service. So I don't know who wants to go first. Alva?
Coming
Yeah.
briefly on perhaps on Marnie's point, I mean, anything is possible. The thing is, how can it actually be done? And it just occurs to me very practically that gaining the support of the relevant unions, particularly the nursing unions, is really very important for a campaign of this kind. And if that could be achieved, or if even there were strong support people in the unions, I think that would make a huge difference, because, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever, I think, in anybody's mind that non-doctor medical professionals in this country must be absolutely raging when they think that, you know, all of the work they have been putting in over the past 3 months is not actually going to lead to any substantial improvement in their conditions or pay, and that we've, you know, done all of this slapping and it hasn't actually eventuated in anything very practical. So I think it's a very, very good moment to be approaching people in the unions, maybe the top level, but certainly the contacts that we have in those relevant unions. And just very quickly on mental health access, I mean, mental health access for women in particular, well, for everybody actually down south who's going in through the public service, it's absolutely lamentable. There's a new policy published today. But I mean, the legwork that has to be done to bring the mental health services up to even some kind of basic level of decency is absolutely huge. And it is so interesting that it's not included in women's health. If you think about it, they don't see mental health as being health. They see it as something else. And I think that's something, I don't know if that applies onto the NHS. Maybe Fiona might comment on that, or indeed Maeve, but it's really important.
Yeah, and I think that point on mental health, like if you look at a vision for change in the South, which is the strategy on mental health, like the absence of any, you know, gender analysis, of gender proofing, it was so absent. I mean, the Women's Council next week, we're going to be launching quite a big sort of survey we've just done in terms of the impact on women's mental health as a result of COVID. But it's just so clear the absence of any focus on women's mental health. The emphasis has been on things like male suicide, and it's been to the detriment of focusing. It's not saying that's not an important issue, but it has been to the detriment in terms of looking at women's mental health, even though women clearly show, you know, high rates in lots of different areas. And it's not just a high or low piece, it's about looking at the needs differently, because they have very different needs.
And of course, that relates to the absence of any emphasis or inclusion within the health arena of the detrimental impact, to put it mildly, on women of domestic violence, in particular all violence against women, but they simply not included. By the way, when you are meeting government and so on to discuss, or whoever it is, if there is a government, to discuss the would you ever teach them the word intersectionality while you're at it?
Yeah.
Because that might be somewhere that they could actually start, because they don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I know you're
critical there.
Just keep saying it again.
Could I come in there, Maeve, just to talk about the two questions? I think on Alva's point about the NHS and whether it takes up women's mental health in particular, I think it's impossible to take up any particular of healthcare, whether that's the crisis in young men, whether that's women's healthcare and the massive gaps there, when there is an agenda that cuts back any of that funding and which critically underfunds it on an ongoing basis. So what attempts there may be to pay lip service, I think that's a good phrase that was, I think, used by Orla just there, to these things. And we hear a lot of lip service in terms of mental health from our politicians in the North because it's a crisis and because that's what people in our communities are fuming about, are talking about, are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So the lip service has really increased. But let me tell you, the funding, the focus, whether it's on women's healthcare or on other particulars in terms of healthcare, has absolutely not. Mental health professionals estimate that we need at least double the funding for just talking therapies in terms of mental health in the North before we can even start to look at mental health lists. We've known this for a long time, but the executive has failed really to put the kind of emphasis and importance on mental health, especially in a post-conflict society where we literally know that the kind of mental health problems are transcending generations and are carrying over. So young people now who are dealing with the overhang of austerity, the kind of difficulties that they have to deal with in society at the minute, the contemplation of a future with climate crisis, are also having to deal with the fact that generational mental health that's particular to our part of the world is not being alleviated for them at all. And then finally, just on the point about the ability of women to fight back, and Alva's important point about the unions on this, I think a really great example of how we can do this, it was the incredible industrial action taken by predominantly female healthcare workers in the North. Really something that came perfect in terms of political timing when the most pressure was on political parties in the North to get a deal, and which said, we don't care if it's snowing outside, we don't care if you've been saying no for 5 years, we are standing here until we get what we need, and really won the hearts of the public before the COVID-19 crisis even shone a spotlight on how important these workers are in our society. And I think if there's a lesson that we can learn from recent action, particularly from women, it's that kind of steadfast approach to saying we want pay, we want decent conditions, and we won't stop standing here. We won't let you ignore us any longer. And I think it's going to take that kind of attitude that those incredible workers showed. And I think that was one time where we can say in particular that, you know, particularly with RCN, the leadership of that union were very much behind the workers. And that's an example that I think Alva's right in saying that we need to be talking to trade unions and getting them involved in the fight for a proper 32 county NHS. And I think that we need to look at that approach where we're backing the workers. We're looking to them for experience of how the show can be run.
And maybe an autumn meeting with all, you know, a unions panel or something might be very helpful, because it gives time to kind of tee that up over the next month or two. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. There will be more meetings, and you know, one on unions and definitely one on mental health as well for all people. So before Adrian, I'm going to ask you, Adrian, to kind of wrap up with a final few words, because I think the other speakers have said a few wee things there on that last point. But before I do, it's just to remind people, if people want to get involved in this campaign for an all-Ireland National Health Service, in the comments section, there's a sign up place that you can sign up, and there's organising meetings. There's one this Thursday at 6:30 on Zoom, where we're trying to tie in local actions with this national movement. So the more people involved, the stronger this campaign becomes, and now is the time for it. So Adrian, if you want to just finish up and with those last two questions, thanks.
Thanks very much, Maeve, and thanks to all our speakers. I really enjoyed that anyway, and I felt I've learned a lot. So I just think it's very important here that we do remember we have a weak government. They're coming in on a mandate that they were never given, really, essentially, is the bottom line. And we need to say very, very firmly that there's no going back, to a two-tier health system. There's no going back to austerity, that we want to see that nationalisation of the hospitals become a permanent, that we want public ownership and control of voluntary hospitals and the National Maternity Hospital. We want better career structures and reward payments for the people who really took the risk during this crisis, and the people that made sure we were safe at a time when we were in crisis across the country. That we want to make sure it is 32 county, so that we can have coordinated approaches going forward for any health crises that established. And we want a publicly established system to regulate access and the price of medicines, and an integrated health and social care services. But we have to remember that all of this is absolutely possible. Abortion care in Ireland, North South, was not possible until we fought and won for it. Gay marriage in Ireland was not possible until we fought and won for it. And if you look at the recent history of Ireland, North and South, you'll see that all the positive and progressive changes have come from the streets, have come from different campaign meetings, public meetings here, then organising meetings, then building up that confidence of people to actually say, listen, we deserve better, and that we're going to take it if you don't give it to us. So I'll finish there, but I want to thank again all the speakers. Thanks, May, for inviting us here, and that we really hope people continue to get involved, because the future is very much in our hands.
Thanks, everyone. Good
Thank
night.
you. Night, everybody. Thanks, Maeve. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye.